There's no safe place in Gaza. William Ackman, who organized the campaign, there's nothing like it in American history. They overthrew the president of Harvard. I mean, that's like unbelievable. And she was a black woman in this woke era. They unseated her. They unseated President McGill of the University of Pennsylvania. This was a Jewish supremacist. I do not believe they're Zionists. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Zionism. I know something about the subject. They're not really Zionists. There was a famous social critic, his name was Irving Howe, and he famously said, if you have enough money in your pocket to buy a one-way ticket to Israel and you don't, then you're not a Zionist. And I think that's true. If you understand the Zionist ideology, its essence was there's no future for Jews in the quote-unquote diaspora.
Interesting.
And so if you have it, if that's the essence of Zionism, there's no future for Jews in the diaspora, and you don't buy the one-way ticket to Israel.
This is just still white supremacy.
I don't believe they're Zionists.
If you look at the prime ministers of Israel,
that's it.
It's
William Ackman.
European Jews who changed their name to Semitic names. Like Netanyahu, his surname was Milokowski. And it's been every Israeli prime minister has changed their name from a European name. These are Europeans who convened and decided to become settler colonialists after the Berlin Conference. And they were influenced and cited the Berlin Conference along the way. Not necessarily the conference, but the methods and the model of European settler colonialism. You do not see prime ministers in Israel that are Semitic Jews, Arab Jews, etc., Palestinian Jews, which they do exist. I don't think we've had a Sephardic Jew. Now, looking it up, Israel has never had a Sephardic prime minister. And I'm sure they've had Sephardic members in their government. I know they have Ethiopians in their military. But there is a power structure, a power order, where you have mass immigration from Europeans using propaganda, I should say dehumanization propaganda, to justify and garner support for settler colonialism in this quote-unquote woke era that he talks about. They still do it, and only recently has support for Israel in the United States dropped below 50%. So this has been going on. This has been an occupation, this has been an apartheid for this long, and it's supported. And you'd have to ask yourself, would this be supported if these were two Arabian groups, two Middle Eastern groups? And I would say no, that what you're talking about here is not Jewish supremacy, especially since most Zionists are not Jewish. You say, okay, let's say it's a drop below 50%. You don't have that many Jews in the U.S. If people are supporting Israel and they believe Israel should exist, even though the history shows that they outlined Palestine as a place to colonize, no different than the various, all the colonialism. I mean, Europe colonized the vast majority of the nations. I think it was like all but a handful. This, to me, is where he has blinders. He's calling it Jewish supremacy. But just look at the last two U.S. presidents. Biden said point blank he's a Zionist. He's not Jewish. Look at Congress. They're continuing, no arms embargo, continuing to fund Israel. When I could go into more details, look up all the groups that have outlined what's going on in Gaza as a genocide. But I want to get to the topic. I just disagree there, and I think that's one of the problems that leads to, or seeing this as Jewish supremacy and not white supremacy, which may lead to why I would say the anti-Zionist that is also against reparations ultimately plays himself. And I wouldn't, people might ask, like, why are you an anti-Zionist? Aren't you a reparationist? Or you can't be both. I would argue, to some degree, you have to be both. Because, let's say, Kamala Harris, as she did, I don't have to say, let's say, Kamala Harris did not say that she would support an arms embargo. She would push for an arms embargo in Israel. And this is after their military leaders and their prime minister were wanted on the world courts as war criminals. After there was a warrant for their arrest, she still couldn't say that. Now, let's say, now this is hypothetical. Let's say she actually pushed and argued up reparations. I wouldn't trust it. I would not trust that someone who would support a colonial genocide would then be truthful about supporting reparations. I would see it as a ruse. And I would not play myself. I would not vote for someone pushing reparations who was also against, even when it's popular, an arms embargo on Israel. I don't trust that someone who is that comfortable with genocide is going to be some sort of arbiter of justice. And likewise, an anti-Zionist should not expect any type of justice or any type of reckoning with Israel when they also do not support, or are comfortable, I should say, with a racial caste. And we're past the point where it's binary. It's either racial caste or reparations, because Black Americans are not magical. We can't endure a gauntlet of human rights violations as a lineage and then walk it off and shake it off. No, anybody. Because people aren't, if we have magic, our magic is very similar. So any group that experiences incalculable human rights violations, especially if they're not constantly altered by dramatic population increases, like coming from a more brain drained, or I said brain drained, but I'm talking about, like, when we have immigrants, we usually have people who have acumen or they're refugees. If you have people with acumen who are better in terms of scholarship, as far as having money, resources, we're not adding Africans that have that in any great number. And to the degree that we do, it would still be, and I say great number compared to like 90% of Black Americans are still descendants of slavery. Close to 90%. I think it's actually a little bit less now. But if you were to compare that to Asians, most Asians are newer immigrants. There are some that go further back. This is true with East Asians, West Asians, and it's slowly becoming truer with Europeans. Although for now, I think most European Americans, period, I should say white Americans, they go as far back as Ellis Island, and then of course you have some that go back further than that.
I say stay away
But
from
I want to
that
get to the
stuff.
next clip.
Fight for what is clearly, in your interest and which is palpable. Fight for jobs. fight for housing. We don't fight for these reparations. It's crap.
No, the reason I'm laughing is because selfishly you're confirming how that I've been more or less correct in my interpretation of your work and my application of it in other circles. I mean, that has been largely how I've been trying to argue. And in fact, my own argument around reparations for descendants of African people is really a broad approach to revolutionizing the entire society, as opposed to focusing specifically on reparations. So specific, me personally, I have no particular disagreement with what you said, and I would only encourage people who have not
I've got
read
my issues with Jared Ball.
work to read the Holocaust.
He made a great article. I think he wrote an article, and I know he had videos on it. He might even wrote a book about the myth of Black spending power. And I agree with that almost completely, and to the extent that I don't agree with it, it's not really relevant. My issues with him aren't even related to where I disagree with him on Black spending power. I largely agree with him on it anyway. It is a myth. There's no real power in consumption, and that's what we're often presented with. I might as well just say it since this won't be long. The area where I disagree with him on that is I think there's still something to be said. And maybe I don't disagree. Maybe he covered this and I didn't read it. But I think there's still something to be said about the tax paying power that you have when 90% of employable Black Americans are employed. There are times when I think it goes below 90%, but it's usually in that area. And that's usually kind of low compared to other people with more unemployment. But we're still talking about a largely employed group that is earning enough money to where they can spend almost $2 trillion a year. I think that when you look at the type of taxes that brings in, it spits in the face of the people who will just count up all of welfare and say, look, you've already gotten reparations. Look how much money you've cost us and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, if we're spending $2 trillion a year, that's covering those taxes for that. So what else are we talking about? Where else are we costing this nation? But my issue, though, real issue with Jared Ball is instead of making an argument against reparations, he was part of the group, actually, I won't say he was part of the group that did it, because he's more of the anti-Black socialist, where he'll stall out reparations because we need to whatever socialist policy changes first. And then once we do that, and then he'll argue that America's too racist to do it anyway. And I'm like, if that's the case, then, and I disagree with that. I brought up a Reparations Ventures poll in another video that showed that most Americans are not against reparations. They don't oppose reparations. What you have is something like a 39%, 38% approval, which is higher than it's ever been. And this has been trending towards us anyway. And then you have, I think, 19% neutral and maybe 46% opposed. I don't know if those numbers line up. Yeah, my issue with Jared Ball also, my other issue I have with Jared Ball, is when I say he was a part of the group, and he was more solo, this is kind of a different group, is he was one of the people who was accusing ADOS of being right-wing. Now, ADOS, the co-founders of ADOS are both liberal Democrats. If you've listened to them, they're both people who, to some degree, are with him when it comes to some of the left-wing stuff. Like Tone doesn't believe that there should be billionaires. I think Yvette has said that to have billionaires, especially to the degree that they're in the tens and hundreds of billions, means that you failed in terms of government, like you failed. These are not right-wingers. These are not MAGA people. And to say that is just a lie. And he'll say it, but he won't give any reasoning for it. And I remember he was with Nick. I don't know Nick's last name. So I think it's Nick Cruz. And he was on a video with him where they were talking about ADOS. I don't even remember what they said. But Nick Cruz is the same person that also argued that ADOS voted for Kamala Harris. And he's kind of in that same anti-Zionist mode where you're running interference on reparations. And this I don't understand. I don't understand Nick Cruz. We're talking about people. He accused Yvette Carnell of voting for Kamala Harris, being like a blue no matter hooligan Democrat. So which one is it with them? Are they MAGA, as Jared Ball argued? Then are they blue no matter hooligans, and Nick Cruz argues? And it's neither when you listen to them. When you listen to them, it's pretty plain. If anything, they're Nick Cruz, I think he probably voted for Jill Stein. I suspect that is also true with Yvette Carnell, or maybe she voted for Cornel West, but she didn't say who she voted for, but she often mentioned that there are non-party options. And she did say she wanted Jill Stein to go to the ADOS conference. So this is like confusion for the sake of confusion with Nick and Jared. What you have is someone who's playing himself, because you don't have a solution, a real long-term solution, without reparations for Palestinians. You can't have that, because if you were to just say, okay, we're just going to give Gaza back, you still have a problem with people wanting to return to places where they have deeds. But you also have a group, and this was true before October 7th, where there's a huge wealth gap in the GDP of Palestine and Israel. And now you have a situation where Palestinians are going to want to kill Israelis. They're going to want revenge. So you need a period of separation. You need a period of reparations, to the point where you have a scenario where Jews who got reparations after the Holocaust are not threatening Germany. Germans are not in fear of Jewish terrorists. But Finkelstein cannot make this case. He cannot make a case that will lead to real peace, because he's against reparations in his own nation. And he's against it even after he admits to seeing racism in ways that a lot of us don't get to see. He told on white, and we're going to see this in a minute, on the racism he grew up with amongst white Jews. And this also makes me wonder, why he just doesn't call this white supremacy.
Literate, you have a beautiful vocabulary and you speak mellifluous prose. So of course you know Philip Roth. What an American Jewish child inherits, said Roth, is no body of law, no body of learning, and no language, and finally, no Lord, because he's writing when Jews are overwhelmingly secular, but a kind of psychology. And the psychology can be translated in 3 words: Jews are better. That was part of the ethic that we internalized. So that's half the story. And then there's the other half. There's a kind of mythology about how Jews support the civil rights movement and how Jews and blacks got along so well. I grew up in a lower middle class neighborhood. I can tell you, and I honestly don't want you to be offended. I'm trying to be factual, okay? I grew up with the smartest, the most civilized of Jews, because I like to be in that crowd. I like to be among smart people. That was my thing, okay? I wasn't at their level, but I like to be in that crowd, okay? Black people were typically referred to as Schwarzes, Coloreds, and niggers. But that's absolutely a fact. I know that may make you kind of queasy, but that's true. And I'm talking about my friends, their parents, everybody. We lived in a neighborhood where it was lower middle class, but they had maids come in the morning, and they would leave at 5 o'clock. And we didn't have public transportation. We had a private bus service called the Pioneer Bus. And the maids would leave at 5 p.m. And you know what they nicknamed that bus?
What did they nickname the bus?
The Nigger Express. That's how we grew up. I had a friend, Ellen Schoenfeld, her brother, Richard Schoenfeld. I remember vividly, we're talking about 60 years ago, 55 years ago. I still remember having this conversation with Richard in front of the parents. He said, all niggers should be put in gas chambers. And believe it or not, we were supposed to be having a rational conversation about that. And I was trying to persuade him that that's not a nice thing to say, or not an accurate
thing. This is a conversation about gas chambers that's being had in the decades immediately following the Holocaust.
Exactly. So when you asked me, and I know I'm going to get a lot of nasty pushback at what I'm saying, but sorry, folks, I have a good memory. I have a very good memory. So when you ask me, is there an element of racism? I have to say, when you combine the first element, Jews are better, with the second element, namely this kind of loathing, contempt for black people, I would have to say yes, of course. Of course.
So people who the Holocaust was like a decade away at the time, maybe less than 2 decades. He's not that old. But we're talking very recent history. It's still relatively recent in human history. Yet they want to put Black Americans who went over to Germany to fight the Germans. They're saying that they belong in ovens. If he knows this, what kind of sicko is he to be against reparations? What chance in hell do Black Americans have if this is what we get from white people who experience the heavy hand of white supremacy within the last 2 decades of then saying that Black people should be put in ovens? He's not sugarcoating it. He's not lying to kick it. He's not trying to get a date. He's telling it like it is. Yet he's still missing the forest through the trees because he's still playing himself. Because just like you're not going to get reparations from Zionists, you're not going to get justice for Palestinians from people who are comfortable in a caste system in their own nation.